Now let's take an example, a complete example of a melee. Now what we have here, it's my turn. I have some heavy cavalry and some skirmishers supporting me. And ahead of me is an enemy unit of heavy foot with long spears. It's my turn. Earlier in the turn, I fired these guys and managed to disorder the heavy foot. No permanent losses were put on them. So the skirmishers are done. Now the next unit I choose to activate will be the heavy cavalry. Their movement is 8, and I want them to move into contact, charge this heavy foot unit. Even though it's kind of a disadvantage because this heavy foot unit does have long spears, which nullifies my impetus bonus. Now, my heavy cavalry unit has a VBU of 8 and an impetus bonus of 2. Now, the impetus bonus will be nullified by the long spears. The enemy heavy foot has a VBU of 4, and they have disorder, however, which will give them a penalty, if you remember, in the close combat. So, okay, let's move here and make contact with the enemy. First thing I do, I could see it's a frontal attack, so there's no flank here. And I measured the distance. It's going to be a straight move ahead in this case, and it's 5 centimeters. Now I'm going to be interpenetrating the skirmishers, which, if you remember, they'll be moved out of the way and placed behind the cavalry unit once I make the move. And as you can see, their base isn't completely cleared. So I move it out of the way temporarily, put me into contact with my straight move, and then put the skirmishers directly behind them to show that I interpenetrated them. Now, we're ready to resolve the combat. Now again, heavy cavalry, they have a VBU of 8, and there's my 8 dice. The enemy infantry will also be rolling at the same time. They have a VBU of 4. I'll put 4 dice up there. Now, for me, for the heavy cav, modifiers, well, there is none really. There's no terrain involved. There's no flank attack. The only thing that is counted here is my impetus bonus has been nullified, which would have been an extra 2 dice. Not in this case. I don't get it. So I have 8 dice. The opposing heavy foot has a VBU of 4. There's his 4 dice he will be rolling. Now, the only other modifier here, he doesn't get the impetus bonus, but he is disordered, which means he will have a -1 die. So he's at 3 at this point. And again, there's no other terrain or other modifiers. So that's the roll. He rolls 3, I roll 8. So let's see what we get here. I'll roll these all at once. And let's see what we get. And the heavy foot got 1 hit with a 6, and that's it. We have a 2 and a 2, so they're removed. The charging cavalry, let's see. They got 2 5s and a third 5, which is discounted. And that's it. So they got 1 hit. So 1 hit on the heavy foot, and I'll put these dice to remind me how many hits were involved here. And both sides have to now make cohesion tests. And I'll use a black die for the heavy foot, and I'll use a white dice for the heavy cavalry. So let's see. I'll do the cavalry first. Their VBU, if you remember, is 8. Minus the damage they just took, it's 7. Now, there's no other modifiers to the test. And if you remember, if they're a general unit, they get +1. If they're disordered, they get a -1. Neither one applies here. So, they need a 7 or less. Now, if you remembered, if you ever need a 6 or greater to pass a cohesion test, you always fail on a roll of a 6. And you take 1 damage if you're already disordered, because if you take the test, pass or fail, you are disordered. And I'm not disordered in this case. So anything but a 6. And I got a 2. So they're okay. They took no losses, but they are disordered. Now, the enemy foot makes their cohesion test. Now, normally their VBU is 4, minus the 1 point of damage makes it 3. -1 for disorder makes it 2. So they need a 2 or less to pass this test. And they get a 2. So they pass their test. So they took no permanent losses, but they do become disordered. Now they're already disordered, which means they automatically take 1 hit on their VBU. And they keep the current disorder they have. Now, what happens here, there's no rout. There's also no loser to the combat because this 1 permanent loss was due to a disorder, not from actual combat. from the damage roll. So this combat will be considered drawn, and that would end it. Now, if this side did not take its turn yet, when this unit activates, they will get to fight this combat again. Let's just assume that happens, and let's activate this combat. Okay, he activates this heavy foot unit. They're going to fight. So, once again, we total our dice. For the heavy foot, we'll do them first this time. They start off with a VBU of 4, minus 1 for the permanent loss is 3. Disorder, minus another 1, which is 2. They only get 2 dice. No other modifiers. Heavy Cav, again, they have 8 VBU. No damage to it, so they're an 8 VBU. There's no charging or moving here into contact, so there's no modifier for impetus, which would be nullified anyway if it did have it, if you remember. So it's just a straight 8 dice, minus 1, however, for the disorder. So now they're down to 7 dice. Okay, again, we need double 5s and 6s. Let's see what these guys get. And we got a 6 for the heavy foot, and nothing for the heavy cav. The heavy cav did nothing. Ooh. So 1 hit on the heavy cav. So the heavy cav have to make a cohesion test. The heavy infantry don't. So let's make the heavy cav's test. Now their VBU is 8 minus the damage they just took, which is 1, so it's 7. They're disordered minus another 1, so it's 6. So again, they only fail on a 6. And they rolled a 3. So they passed the test. However, they do become disordered because they took the cohesion test. They're already disordered, which means they keep the current disorder and take 1 permanent loss. Now, there's no routes and there's no retreats because neither side is the loser in this case. There was no permanent losses inflicted from the actual combat. So basically, both units stay in place. So this is a drawn combat. And the next turn, we'll repeat this again. And whichever side gets to go first will activate the melee and they'll fight. So that's an example of a combat.